Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. I'd like to welcome all of those of you who are new listeners and those of you who've been subscribing. I hope this has been valuable information and material for you to factor into your reflections. So in the last podcast, I was talking about how jealousy is not healthy, despite the things you may read on the internet. And again, let me encourage you, take what you read on the internet with somewhat of a grain of salt. Make sure if you are going to follow a particular idea or train of thought, check it out. Sometimes it helps to look at opposing views. And that's the thing that I talked about with regard to jealousy. Okay, it was a curious idea that jealousy could be healthy. So why did I take such a strong position to fundamentally explain why not? Well, if you haven't heard the last podcast, let me encourage you to go back and listen to it. But for today, where I want to take a look at the link between jealousy and patriarchal socialization of boys and men, I want to tie in that whole area of attachment, okay, and how patriarchy actually disturbs appropriate, secure attachment, not just in boys, but also in females. So let's start with the whole notion. So what's the problem with patriarchy? Well, as I've said before in different podcasts, if we go down to the four core values of patriarchy, we're talking about patriarchy being about territory. It's about being status and hierarchy. It's about being acquisitional, and it's certainly about being competitive. So you're probably wondering, how does this relate to relationships? How does it relate to jealousy? Well, let me connect the dots for you a little bit. So if we go back to the origins of patriarchy, which is about 10,000 years ago, and patriarchy really emerged out of the agricultural revolution. Okay, so, prior to that, if we look at hunter-gatherers, the reality was that hunter-gatherers didn't have the same ideas necessarily about relationships that developed out of the agricultural revolution. Okay, many of the hunter-gatherer tribes do not exclusively pair bond. So this might blow some of you right out of the water, but monogamy is not necessarily a natural human trait. It's a social artifact. In other words, we're socialized into this, and at times with some heavy penalties. For instance, if you read the Bible, anyone who was adulterous or who had sex outside the monogamous context was actually punished by death. He got stoned, not with the green stuff, but essentially with real stones. It was, all over Red Rover for you if you decided to have, extramarital relationships. Now, interestingly enough, often there were ways and means in which men were capable of extricating themselves from those harsh punishments by, putting the spotlight on the woman, the whole idea of the seductress, the succubus, all those sorts of ideas came into play in order to reinforce culturally, socially, the idea of monogamy. Now, don't get me wrong for 1 second. I'm not suggesting that, this is going to be a free-for-all and that we should all go and have wonderful promiscuous sex in our culture. That's not how it works. But what I'm basically getting at is that the notion that human beings are inherently a species that mates exclusively with one partner is a social idea that stems fundamentally from the emergence of patriarchy through the agricultural revolution and through very much the relationship between a social hierarchy, the enforcement of paternity to ensure material security, and essentially the way that we keep certain parts of our society in check. Okay? So when we talk about jealousy is a form of responding angrily and fearfully to the potential loss of my partner. So rather than being an equal partner with my spouse, I'm now in essence, in a position of dominating and controlling her through my behaviour. So jealousy is a big, scary green monster that often comes into relationships fairly quickly. Okay, it's also about ownership. So, and it's a two-way street. When I look at some of the teenage boys that I work with in the relationships that they have with some of the girls, I find some of their behaviour, the girls' behaviour, a bit scary too. I mean, getting 30 texts about where are you in a 4-hour period because he's out with the boys having a good time is simply inappropriate, unhealthy behaviour. This is not a good thing. It doesn't mean she loves you. It means, in her view, subconsciously, she's going through the conflict between wanting to own you and control you because she's scared of losing you. You might just run off with some other, hussy or, floozy out there, And we talk about boys slut shaming, but girls do this behaviour as well, just maybe slightly differently. So, jealousy in relationships in Western culture is a social artefact. Right? It's because we're forced into this way of viewing relationships that are based on ownership and a power struggle. It's also been about resources, a lot of which comes to us through varying traditions and not necessarily healthy traditions. So what are we then talking about when we talk about attachment in this context? As an adult, right? What is it that I'm looking at, both in myself but also in my partner? Well, as I pointed out in the last session, we're talking about different types of attachment styles. And before I get into the secure attachment, let me go back and flesh out what are we looking at. So one of the attachment styles is about being anxious and preoccupied. So those people with anxious, preoccupied attachment styles are essentially high on the anxiety dimension but low on the avoidance dimension. So these individuals have difficulty trusting their partners, commitment to them. They're also generally a lot more pessimistic and worried about their relationships. They often need and seek constant reassurance from their partner and will create or manipulate and amplify conflicts in the relationship. So this is the particular attachment style where we're looking at jealousy as being a serious factor. And so as a result of their behaviour, the way that they deal with things, they tend to have very tumultuous, very emotionally dysregulated experiences in their relationship, and it draws the other person in with them. Okay? The other attachment style that we talk about a lot is dismissive avoidant. Okay? So those people with a dismissive avoidant attachment style are low on anxiety but high on avoidance. Okay? So how does that work? So let me give you an example. It's the person who seems to lack a wider range of emotional response. So they often come across as being aloof and emotionally distant in the relationship. So they're not giving off a great sense of being in contact or being engaged. So the sense of the experience of intimacy with that person actually is very, very, low. They often talk about a fear of commitment, but essentially what they're doing is avoiding contact. They also may work very, very hard at asserting their independence, especially through things like work, sport, hobbies, social activities that really don't include their partner. Now, I see that particular attachment style quite frequently with a lot of men. They often have a partner who's yearning for that level of emotional and even physical intimacy, but their partner doesn't provide that. They work very hard at keeping that to themselves. They're not expressive. I remember working with one guy, and he even had a challenge in holding hands in public. To him, it was sort of something that he didn't really do. He didn't show a great deal of affection. Okay, so over the next little while in certain podcasts about relationships, I'm going to bring some of this more and more into focus, and I'm going to challenge some of you to really examine your own attachment style in this instant. So, what's the next one? The next one is being fearful avoidant. Okay, so what does that mean? So those people with a fearful avoidant attachment style are high on both anxiety and avoidance. People like that, men like that especially, or women, both fear and desire intimate relationships. So they're really in conflict. So it's a bit like I love you, I hate you. Not quite to that degree. That applies more to what we call the borderline personality disorder. So let me explain a little bit further. So on the one hand, they want the support and security that comes from having a significant other, but on the other hand, they're constantly preoccupied and worry about the fact that their significant other will at some point or another hurt them. And yet at the same time, they'll feel stifled by the relationship. You know, the statement of I need to find myself is often indicative of that, where they haven't shared with their spouse what's really going on. And men particularly at that point are often in and out of the relationship, and their partner's wondering what the hell is going on here. So as a result, people with a fearful avoidant attachment style can be really inconsistent towards their partner, even from a day-to-day basis. And their ambivalent attitude can lead to some serious chaos. The couples where I've worked with this particular style was very evident in their relationship, are giving off mixed messages all the time, and it's very difficult to pin them down. What is it that they exactly want in the relationship? So, again, a little bit of a warning. The categories are helpful in describing the extremes, but obviously there's shades of grey and crossovers and so on. Now, let me bring this back into play, why this is relevant when we talk about patriarchy. And one of the things that I talk about with patriarchy is that the way boys are socialised makes them very, very sensitive to either being over-nurtured or under-nurtured and experiencing that insecurity in themselves, firstly in their relationship with themselves, but secondly in their relationship with others, because relationships with others become competitive in some form or another. But the really, really important factor in this is that patriarchal socialization narrows boys' emotional vocabulary down. So in either of those